I don't know whether you realise this is one of my favourite topics when it comes to the entire landscape of organised crime. Encrochat, for a number of reasons. I have a particular bee in my bonnet about how it was handled here in Ireland, because we didn't actively, as such, we've heard nothing through the courts. I'm always following the cases in the UK and beyond. There was decisions made, I think, in Ireland to use it as intel only. Now, as other things are coming through the courts, I can kind of see maybe how there was a money laundering case there this week, and I can see the date, and it looks to me like there might have been some listening in. But I suppose start by anybody who doesn't know explaining what Encrochat was and how significant it has been in the fight against organised crime.
I mean, Encrochat, the impact that it's had in terms of arrests, first of all, but then actual convictions is pretty unprecedented, really. So if we look at some of those numbers, we're talking about over 3,000 arrests in UK. We're talking about over 1,000 convictions. And of course, those numbers will change, certainly in terms of the number of convictions, because a lot of those cases are still active. So we could see more convictions. I think no doubt we will see more convictions coming up in the following months, following years even. This is ongoing. In the simplest terms, I would explain Encrochat as a phone network, which to you and me and to most people would seem to be super, super secure. But beyond that, it had very particular features, a very particular set of specialisms that you could use with it, that made it the network of choice for the criminal fraternity. And it would cost a fair bit of money, but you weren't just buying the network, you were buying the cred and the status that came with it. And I think today, the reason we're talking about Encrochat and the reason so many people within the world of everyone that's interested in crime are talking about Encrochat is because just the numbers of people that have been convicted on evidence that was harvested from Encrochat are huge.
And like there was something about, wasn't there something like 70,000, I think, handsets out there between the various territories. It was largely used in England, in the UK and Europe. Basically, there's been other phone hacks involving Australia and the US, but Encrochat wasn't the only phone on the market. Do you think, Mobeen, that it became kind of like trendy, like the way things do, like criminals started talking about which network they were using, and then they all felt they had to get an Encrochat like a Rolex watch?
I think it did become really trendy. And, I have to say, I'll tell you a story. I remember years ago, before I think it was the first time I ever heard about Encrochat, actually. I was covering a trial up in Leeds. It was at Leeds Crown Court. And it was for a series that I was making at the time. So this would be back in 2018. I think it was the end of 2018. So, of course, at this point, Encrochat is still very much in use. And it came up as part of the prosecution's case in this trial that went on for about 3 or 4 weeks that I was covering. And I remember the prosecution cross-examining this person who was accused when he took the stand and trying to explain to the jury that there was this super encrypted phone network called Encrochat. And then they asked him, they said, why would you need this phone if it wasn't for, dodgy dealings, effectively? And I remember him saying words to the effect, and I'm paraphrasing. He said, well, I've got 2 phones and a lot of girls ask me for my number. So I've got one phone, which I'll use generally. And then I've got this Encrochat phone. And the reason it's encrypted is because I don't want to give these girls my number because I don't want to stay in contact with them. And I remember looking at the jury's faces, and a lot of people in the courtroom just didn't understand what this was. I mean, the fact of it is, in that period, 2018, 2019, and somewhat into 2020, I think there's no doubt at all that Encrochat was the kind of zeitgeist phone for people within organized crime, to the point where I've had conversations with people who said that if they were in that world and they were making a contact and the contact didn't have an Encrochat phone, they'd think they weren't worth doing business with.
Yeah.
It was a real tool of the trade. And to get into those circles and to move and shake in those circles, you had to have one. So I think that's why there were so many users.
And wouldn't it have been extreme to have one in order to keep the girlfriends separate from the kind of the one night stands? Crazy. But the sort of the things on the phone were, firstly, that the server was sort of seen as a bulletproof server. You could send messages from one phone to the other, and there was supposed to be absolutely no way anybody could listen in, could hack in, anything like that. I'm just being very basic because I'm not very technical with these things. But also that if you wanted to, you could remotely delete the entire system. If you were arrested, basically, and you could do that from a distance. Was it true that there was certain applications on it that if you were at a certain distance from the phone, that it would literally automatically delete?
So I'm also not a super technical person.
Okay, good.
I don't know about that particular feature. What I do know, and keep in mind, I was given for maybe half an hour by the NCA an Encrochat phone to play with effectively. And so what I do know is when you see it, it just looks like an Android phone. And effectively it is. It's a refurbished Android phone. It has 2 modes. Mm-hmm. So when you power it up, there's the kind of standard mode, which has, you and I wouldn't be able to recognize it as being anything different. But then you put in a particular set of numbers and then it goes into Encrochat mode. Then it looks distinct and then it looks different. I mean, the one feature that made my jaw drop, which I think is really smart if you're in those circles, is the wipe pin code. So I'll explain what the wipe pin code is. So the whole idea was, yes, you could delete the content of the phone remotely, but the other thing was, if you ever got arrested and the police said, of course, police will ask, can you give us your PIN code? It's then up to the individual, whether they're being questioned or charged or whatever, to give that PIN code or not. In this instance, you could behave in a way where you suggested you were being really helpful and you'd say, okay, yeah, I'll give you the PIN code. You'd hand over this PIN code, but it wasn't the PIN code. What it actually was a wipe PIN code, which would mean the officers might put that number in. And as soon as they did, the contents of the phone, including any messages, any evidence on there, would disappear. You can see why this phone was so attractive to people within that world. Of course you can. And
I guarantee you, if it was me now and I had my back up against the wall, I wouldn't remember that bloody pin. I'd probably give them the wrong one.
Yeah, of course. There'd be that difficulty in remembering the correct code, wouldn't there? But I mean, this is the thing that you could give that PIN code and then act like you were being helpful.
Yeah.
Essentially. And what were the police going to say to you? The content of the phone would have gone, and that would have been it.
Wiped. Now, on Catching the Kingpins, which is a Gangster presents, and it's the BBC crime podcast series. I love the Gangster series, actually, I have to say. Mm-hmm. Listen to all of them. This is, you have basically got inside the kind of the investigation behind that, this Encrochat in the UK with the NCA. And over 6 episodes, you tell different stories, I think, and different aspects of it, which makes it really interesting. But the Encrochat hack was developed by the French and the Dutch. And the hack went on from sometime early April 2020 over a period of 3-4 months, was it?
Exactly. So it went into the lockdown period, so March, April 2020. Exactly.
Yeah. I remember it exactly, like in April of 2020 when we were all in lockdown and we were able to travel as journalists. There was a gangland murder actually in Belfast, but it was an Irish organised crime figure called Robbie Lawler, and he'd been murdered on the 5th of April. And I was, covering it, but equally delighted to be able to leave my home and get in the road and travel, But it's interesting, that investigation, because the Encro hack was ongoing at that point, and none of the evidence has yet come up. But it looks it looks as if there could have been some Encro information given. But that's in around the time period that it started. And what happened was, from my understanding, the Dutch and the French, coordinated by Europol, disseminated the information and sent it forward to the various territories. You know, the UK got anything related to what was happening in England, Wales, Scotland, and the north of Ireland. The Irish Gardaí got anything that was relevant to them. But I suppose getting in behind that, so the NCA, how did they handle it? Because they must have been getting a vast amount of information every hour, let alone every day.
Yeah, of course. And keep in mind then, a lot of this information was also handed over from the NCA to particular police forces. So a lot of it went to the Met, for example. And that's purely because a lot of subjects, a lot of individuals who were involved, whose details were on there, were in the Met's patch. And then what you saw is a kind of joint up policing operation where the Met would contact various police forces. The NCA was across all this. We're talking about, globally, I think you referenced the figure, we're talking about 60,000 people involved in organized crime globally thought to have used this, who are now convicted criminals. We're also talking about the Met dealing with 14,000 subject lines. So I'm talking about individual, threads coming through on any given day. So the scale of the operation is absolutely massive. And what the Met effectively had to do was balance up, and what the NCA had to do as well was balance these two competing factors. So on one hand, Driss Hayukain, who's the detective who was very senior in this operation at the Met, he would describe going into work, and he'd tell me that when he'd get into work in the morning, he would see a lot of the information that would come through, and it felt like he was reading, a true crime novel. It felt like he would get to a cliffhanger, and then it'd be time to go home, and then he'd need to know what happened next. He described it, and I thought this was quite astounding, as being in the room with organized criminals, like hearing those conversations effectively. Of course, this information, he's not hearing it, he's reading all these details. But it was like being in the room. Now, the balance that the Met and the NCA had to strike is, do they keep going through that information, and do they continue making arrests? Or when those arrests are made, is the cover going to be blown? And, a lot of lawyers at the time that were defending people who were arrested were starting to think this was quite strange. They were starting to think, how did this information get out there? Because, the information that's being given to them and the charges, there seems to be a bit of that puzzle missing. And of course, the bit that was missing is that the defendants and their lawyers at the time didn't realize the police had this inside information. And of course, what eventually ends up happening is Encrochat themselves find out they've been compromised, and then they send out, when I say Encrochat themselves, I'm talking about the company, the actual company, and they end up sending out a notification to all of the users globally saying, we have been the subject of a high level, I think they referenced government at the time. It seems like, government have hacked us effectively, and we can no longer guarantee the security of your messages. So at that point, you can imagine a lot of people around the world who'd been using Encrochat probably turned their phones off and threw them in a river, I guess, just get as far away from it as possible. But for a good few months, the police were just receiving these messages from Dutch and French police and going through them and working through them. And then there was this International Day of Arrests as well, where lots of people got that knock on the door.
Yeah, because I suppose going back to what you were describing as the people who were using Encrochat and the trust they had in it, they were very, very fluid in their conversations. They didn't think for a second anyone was going to be there. And that's obviously feeds into why it feels like you're in the room for these detectives. You handle a couple of different things on the podcast, and we're not going to ruin it for anybody who wants to listen to it. But I suppose in general, what was happening was they were getting live information in. Some of it could be part of an ongoing future investigation into a criminal gang and, dismantling that. But some of the stuff was live. Some of the stuff that was, been fed into police forces, both here in the UK and across Europe, was plots to kill. And I suppose for police at that, in that position, they have to move in. with the primary care of saving a life. They cannot sit back and let that murder go ahead. So they do have to risk, moving in at that point, and the chance really of being blown that it's discovered they're listening in on these networks. So, how do they handle that?
Yeah, so there's a very particular case, and we explore this in the series. So there's a guy called Paul Fontaine who was based in London, in East London actually, and he was contacted by, I guess what you'd describe as a career criminal called Frankie Sinclair. Now, Frankie Sinclair was known to the police on the outskirts of Cardiff in a place called Tremorfa. He was known to the police. I mean, this is a guy, if you look at his track record, I think he had 43 convictions. And the police that we spoke to locally said, as well as those 43 convictions, for years, if there was something going on in the area, generally Frankie was connected. So, they knew that there was a lot of stuff that he was connected to that he hadn't got a conviction for. He was just one of those people whose face was everywhere.
I could have told you that from his name. I mean, Frankie Sinclair is the ultimate gangster name, isn't it? You didn't need to have convictions to tell me the truth.
It is one of those names, Frankie Sinclair. Yeah. So effectively what happens is the Met initially get this data from the NCA. They handed over all this stuff. And there's a username. Of course, it's worth saying, it's not like my phone or your phone. So I wouldn't be saved as Mobeen on your phone, and you wouldn't be, Nicola on my phone. We'd have a username. I don't know if you thought what your username would be, Nicola, but, I'll give you some inspiration. So Frankie, he was called Nude Train.
Right.
That was his handle, Nude Train. And then he's communicating with this person in Hackney, Paul Fontaine, and his name was Usual Wolf. So you've got Nude Train and Usual Wolf. At this point, the Met have no idea, and the police in Tremorfa have no idea who Nude Train is and who Usual Wolf is. But effectively what's happening is Frankie's house had been shot up. The house he lives in with his mother had been the subject of a shooting. And the police locally in Tremorfa knew this, even though it wasn't reported. And actually, when the police went round to Frankie's mother's house, they said, we're hearing there's been some kind of shooting. And they said, yeah, there's nothing to see here, nothing at all. And the police officer that dealt with it, I remember her saying the bay window at the front of the house, it looked brand new. Maybe it was brand new. Maybe there had been a shooting and they just replaced it. So if you can imagine, if Frankie is involved in organised crime and has been for a long time, he's not going to be the kind of person that calls the police if his house is shot at. And what transpires is his house has been shot at, and he then wants revenge on the people that did it. In order to get revenge, what does he need? He needs a firearm. Now, getting a firearm in England, Wales, Scotland, in the UK generally is not that easy. Paul Fontaine, Usual Wolf, is one of the go-to guys. So via Encrochat, Frankie reaches out to Paul, and the police are seeing all this. And he gets him a gun. Now, this takes us to the point you made, which is, at what point did the police intervene and say, okay, there's someone that is going to be organizing a revenge attack. They've asked for a gun. They've got a gun. That attack is imminent. Do we need to sweep in and make that arrest? On the flip side of that, the whole operation, the whole Encrochat operation could be blown,
Mm-hmm.
Like the criminal fraternity could know that these phones are compromised. And so there's a balancing act. And I think in that case, ultimately the police, as they always say, the kind of preserving life trumps everything else. It trumps everything else. And in this case, the arrest was made and the firearm was seized, and that reprisal attack never actually took place. But the case in itself is just fascinating if you want to look at how firearms are obtained in the UK. There's one part of that story where Frankie is sending screen grabs, and there are some images of the bullets and the gun, and the two things don't fit together. And the idea is, and certainly in the view of the Met officers that I spoke to, they were pretty pleased with this idea that it's difficult. You can't just, we're not like America, of course we're not, but you can't easily get your hands on a gun. And because there's not that many firearms readily available, the price is really high. Often getting the bullets is really difficult. And I think the police, certainly the Met, they saw that as a real illustration of success and something to be pleased with.
For sure. And the other shocking point of that story is that Frankie Sinclair lives with his mother.
Yeah, he does. And I mean, she must not been very pleased with being shot at. But yeah, he still lives with his mum. Well, I say he doesn't now. He's in prison right now.
Yeah, I'm slightly disappointed by that little bit. It takes away a bit of his cool. I suppose the one of the big takeaways from Encrochat across Europe was how corrupted our societies have become by organised crime. And that really is largely due to the cocaine boom and the amount of money that there is now available floating around the drugs world. But certainly I remember talking to contacts of mine in Antwerp, and the port there was just so compromised. Biggest entry point of Europe for cocaine cartels. And that was a real takeaway, I think. And so in some cases, they were some of the first levels that they went for in the aftermath of that Encrochat hack being revealed by the company themselves, the phones going into the rivers. And at that point, it was all out there. So they started sort of, I suppose, arresting people. Interesting when we're talking about that the Encrochat hack was able to go on so long with so many officers from so many different countries involved. In UK alone, you had the NCA and the Met Police, and it was disseminating down to local police forces, that none of those officers involved were compromised enough maybe to go to somebody and to set off that alert during the period of the hack,
I think so. I think, there is a story in there as well that we cover in the series, which is about police corruption. But the fact of the matter, as you point out, is I don't think anyone that was actually involved in the operation, no one blew the cover. And so it did remain under the radar. And that international day of arrests and multiple other arrests were made in that period. And it goes back to the thing about scale. I think we're going to be looking at convictions to do with Encrochat, for months, possibly years into the future. And those stories, I mean, I wish I could share. There's particular stories that I've been told by police that are not in the public domain yet, that are just astounding. That stuff is going to come out at some point. We're going to be reading about it in the papers. It is a long, long road, I think. And we're still going to be hearing about trials and convictions based on Encrochat evidence for a long time to come.
I can't get over some of the characters that are washing up in it. There's been a few sort of Irish criminals, very significant criminals, who've been missing for a long time. I'm thinking of a guy called Peter Fatso Mitchell, who washed up in Wales, moving cocaine and being part of this cocaine gang. He was an original member of the John Gilligan gang who scattered to the four winds after the murder of the journalist Veronica Guerin in 1996. And, he was in Spain, Amsterdam, but he'd gone missing. And, he pops up then in Wales Today or one of the Welsh papers and there he goes, caught up in Encrochat. And of course, in the Netherlands, we saw a specialised torture chamber was discovered. There was a meth factory, cooking factory found. There's been all sorts of stuff. To go back to the corruption for a little minute, because I think that shocked authorities that, these organised crime groups have people in the ports, they have people in the police. You have a fascinating story on the podcast of an officer who was compromised and how he was caught. He was working for a London crime group. And of course, when you go back into his history, you could see that he was mates with them, wasn't he?
He was. They were school friends by the look of it.
Yeah.
Yes. It's PC Kashif Mahmud, who was in a lot of ways he was a kind of poster boy, and he worked in East London. He was one of these guys. He was a Met police officer that was obsessed with the gym, posted lots of pictures of himself flexing, all that kind of stuff. And he, if you look at the story at a real surface level, you could think this guy is really, really lucky and brilliant at his job, because what he seems to be doing is approaching cars, doing stop and search. When he's quizzed about it, by the way, he says, it was just a routine stop and search. That's what he often says to his colleagues when he's eventually caught out. But if we go back one stage, on the surface level, he's doing these stop and searches, and then he's finding bags of cash in people's cars. So you think, oh, wow, he must have some kind of sixth sense. So surely he's, taking those bags of cash and then, starting, issuing an arrest, and people will be charged, and these ill-gotten gains will go into the public coffers, surely. But that's not the case at all. What he's actually doing is he is stopping and searching people because he is in bed with an organized crime gang, and the organized crime gang know who they're dealing with. And when people are making payments to them, or when they've made a payment to someone, they'll then tip him off. So they'll say, this car is going to be at this place at this particular time, and they're going to have 20, 30, 40, 100 grand in the car. He turns up in his police uniform, in his police car, and will do a stop and search and then take the cash. But he doesn't make an arrest. This is the thing. Now imagine if you are the person that's just had that money taken, and you yourself are part of the criminal fraternity. You're not going to be holding your hand up and saying, excuse me, are you not going to arrest me? You're going to be thanking your lucky stars that you haven't been arrested.
Exactly.
Thinking, I just need to get away from this situation as quickly as possible. You're not going to be checking them with the police station. You're not going to say, what happened to my cash? You're just going to be thinking, I am screwed because of the people that I owe this money to.
Mm-hmm.
What Kashif Mahmud would actually do is he'd take that money, and rather than it going into the public coffers or anything like that, he would return it to the OCG, and he himself would take a cut.
It's just,
so it was a cyclical kind of thing. I mean, the OCG that he was working with, in one of the messages they sent to him, they said, we can do this to infinity. That's the phrase they used. We can do this to infinity. So their plan was to just keep going with this. I mean, one of the times Kashif Mahmud actually did this, turned up in his uniform and his police car. He was actually on sick leave. Right. He was doing it when he was on sick leave. And ultimately, because of the Encrochat, you could see that he'd been communicating with this OCG, with a Mr. Big as well, who's based in Dubai. And he was caught. And he was convicted. So,
there was no suspicion around him before that. So they could have done it to infinity had it not been for Encrochat, And I think for me now that shows the greed of these criminal organisations, because it's not enough to be making as much as they're making. They want their actual money back as well. And they seem to be always on the lookout for another way of earning, doubling their money. There's never enough. Sure, there isn't. And then the more they get away with, the more untouchable they feel. It's got that confidence seems to really, build up. And, that famous, they do feel untouchable is usually when they're got.
Mm-hmm. I think that's exactly right. You can imagine doing something like that, once or twice and thinking this is, quite scary and we don't want to keep doing this. But then if the money is that good, right? You can imagine thinking, well, we're untouchable. Because if he's turning up in his police uniform, who's going to stop him? Mm. The thing that Kashif Mahmud didn't realize is on one of these particular occasions when he was doing this stop and search tactic, he was being watched by the anti-corruption kind of police. And it was after that, and the reason he was convicted was because of the Encrochat evidence. And so he tripped up. But the people he was in bed with, the OCG he was in bed with, it was a gang called the Khan brothers. There's a lot to suggest that they'd known each other for decades, that they were at school together, that they go way back together. There were pictures that came out of them on holiday together. So in some ways, it was a really smart move, but in other ways, there was so much stuff that they'd put out there, which was going to end up biting them on the arse. And that's exactly what it did. It bit them on the arse, and they've all ended up with convictions.
There's an investigation going on here at the moment into corruption. A particular high-ranking former officer is in jail. He was caught with cannabis in his home. John Spud Murphy. But I have been told that as the investigation, there's all sorts of allegations about corruption he may have been involved in. But I have been told a description could be that he was a criminal, possibly who became a guard, a criminal who became a guard as opposed to a corrupted officer, and that sounds similar to your guy. That, you know, was he somebody that was, you know, it would have been useful for him to become an officer.
Completely. I mean, we've all heard these stories, haven't we? And it sounds a bit like Line of Duty.
Yeah.
But you know, this whole idea of people effectively going into the force with one single intention, and that is to be the person on the inside. And that's exactly what it sounds like. I don't know if realistically we're ever going to know the exact history of how Kashif Mahmud ended up a police officer and why he ended up a police officer. You know, but I think there's a lot to suggest that it's entirely possible that he is a career criminal that wasn't corrupted, that entered the police precisely so he could make these kind of moves. Of course, that's possible.
Yeah, and I mean, I think they're the kind of stories that Catching the Kingpins unearths, and it shows us the sophistication of organised crime. It shows us the kind of the work that was going on behind the scenes while this incredible hack was going on, and in the aftermath, because you also deal with, as the cases start coming before the courts and as the evidence is being used and as that is challenged, you know, that sort of fears in the background that things could collapse. And so far, so good. A lot of people have pleaded guilty anyway in relation to some of the evidence against them. But I listened to Gangster on my normal Apple podcast stuff. It's available everywhere, wherever you get your podcasts, a BBC production. And how did you find working on it? Did you enjoy this?
Oh my God, I loved it. I completely loved it. You know, I love true crime anyway, and I consume a lot of true crime. I listen to a lot of true crime. I watch a lot of true crime, and I'm interested in the criminal world. Yeah. I worked with the most brilliant team. You know, these things are always a massive team effort. And I worked with the most brilliant team. And I think, you know, the thing that I really want to emphasize is on a lot of podcasts, and I think this is a PR thing, a lot of time you'll hear people talk about unprecedented access, unprecedented this and unprecedented that. And I know how difficult it is to get any kind of unprecedented access, particularly in, you know, the world we live in now, where all of this stuff is, you know, if you want to be really cynical about it, all of this stuff is product.
Yeah.
You know, it's like we need to get ears, we need to get eyeballs watching this stuff, we need to get ears listening to it. So unprecedented access is really, really difficult. But this was a really rare example of truly unprecedented access, actually. So to be able to, and, you know, I'd say on previous things that I've done, I've worked with people who, you know, have formerly been, you know, that working at the NCA, for example. I've worked with former police officers. I've worked with current police officers in places like Portland or in Mexico. I did a thing about crystal meth in Mexico. I've worked with police forces in Pakistan. I've worked with LAPD. I've worked with a whole bunch of police forces. But to work with the Met and to speak to NCA officers in this capacity about something that they describe as a pinnacle in their career is genuinely a massive privilege. And also, you know, I want people to know as well, we never went into this with any semblance of doing PR for the police. And of course, as journalists, we never would do that, right?
Yeah.
And so there's lots of parts in this podcast where there is a coming together of some quite difficult subject matter, and individuals from the NCA and the police respond to that stuff, you know, I think really, really well. But none of that stuff was easy. They did deal with some really difficult questions. And a lot of that stuff is still up in the air. So as you'll know, there are still people who, you know, who are defending particular people who have been charged, who've even been convicted, who want to see these cases thrown out of courts, who are still saying there's question marks over the technicalities. And this, I don't want to bore you too much with the difference here, but the difference is between what would be a legal hack,
yes,
which can be used as evidence, and what would be an intercept, which in UK courts can't be used as evidence. So there's question marks over that stuff in the eyes of some people still. You'll see, if you look online, you'll find 100 vlogs and blogs on it in 3 seconds, right? So all of that stuff, I was just really pleased that we got to get into the nuts and bolts of all that. But more than anything, it is just crazy story after crazy story. And, I know, Nicola, you like this stuff because this is very much your world. I think we probably have this in common. Some of this stuff can be quite grim. We're talking about drugs and exploitation and, conspiracy to murder. Really, some of it, though, and let's be frank about it, and I think we really got this in this series, wildly entertaining. The stories about how people end up giving themselves up. People doing things like sharing their birthdays, sending pictures of their dogs, sending selfies. These are meant to be the top of the criminal fraternity. And they let themselves, they send pictures of themselves sometimes with car number plates.
Yeah. Because they like to show off their bling.
They like to show off. It's a guy with a Ferrari, in one episode, it's a guy who just loves his Ferraris. And it starts off with him, sending pictures of the car, and then he's sending pictures of the car with the number plate. Then it's the car in his driveway, so you can identify his house. It's this stuff. It's the vanity. It's the vanity that gets people, and they can't resist.
Well, I think we always kind of like as well when the good guys win, don't we? We have that sort of, it's like back to the cartoons, the goodies and the baddies, and it's good when the good guys win. But there was an Irish guy, actually, he was a logistics guy, and he was caught up in Encrochat in the UK. And I think they caught him, or certainly got close to him, because he took photographs of his feet.
What?
Knew I could shock you.
Why did he take? Was that some fetish thing?
No. His feet were sore. He was complaining about them.
I thought you were suggesting he was doing some OnlyFans business on this.
Well, look. Perhaps I have a far more innocent explanation to it. But anyway.
All the criminals you've mentioned have got much better names than the ones. I know mine have really good handles on Encrochat.
Yeah.
Like Rare Ferret or Super Frog and all these. But you've mentioned someone called Fatso and what was the other one? Spud or something. They've all got great names.
Yeah. Oh, they do. They all have great names here. But I actually wonder, you need a psychologist to go through the handles they have on Encrochat, because some of them are just super bizarre. Some of them are all about being big and rich and everything. But then some of the other ones are just so strange that...
Sand Ferret. What is Sand Ferret? That was actually one of the... we're talking about criminals and, pointing a finger at themselves. A guy that was dealing predominantly with money laundering, he decided to call himself Bank Boss.
Yeah.
Come on, you're going to call yourself Bank Boss.
Rocket science.
Someone a clue to what you might be about, really.
Well, you see, it goes back to the confidence they had that they were never going to get caught with these things. They were absolutely never. And of course, then I thought what was even more wonderful was after Encrochat went, the Americans, the FBI, had already got their own network going where they had actually sold the phones themselves, and a lot of them got caught in it. But you see, the fact is, and it's easy for us to laugh at this, but criminal networks are so global now that they actually cannot operate without being on a phone or having communication. Gone are the days that they'd rattle up and meet one another on a quiet street corner or under a lamp, or, things have got so big and so complex that they're like a multinational firm and they have to communicate. So, that's why they have all been caught. And there's loads more Encrochat stories to come. We can maybe talk about some of them when they come up again. But for now, Mobeen Azhar, thank you very much. And I absolutely recommend anybody to listen to your podcast, Catching the Kingpins.
It's been a lot of fun. Thank you so much, Nicola.
Thanks a mil. I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel. and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.